rather busy these days getting ready for their 150th anniversary. But Lyon's body went across the nation in a special funeral train.
How did he die? I mean, he was wounded several times.
Actually, he was wounded twice. As is often the case early in the war, as Lyon had never commanded that large a force. He'd never been an Army commander. He'd been an Army captain. And he led from the front, a mistake many generals did earlier in the war. And he exposed himself recklessly to danger. He'd been wounded in the calf, wounded in the head. His horse had been shot out from under him. And finally, he was repositioning some troops to meet a Confederate attack and was shot through the heart. At various times in the war, almost all the famous leaders gave in to the urge to be too close to the front. Grant did it, Lee did it, Sherman. Jackson famously wounded by his own men. But Lyon was really not focused on the big picture and too much playing a captain's role, and it cost him his life. Ironically, his foe at that battle, Benjamin McCulloch, would lose his life the following March at the Battle of Pea Ridge in precisely the same manner, by going directly to the front when he should have been remaining in the rear and taking care of the big picture.
Now, Lyon's death was a national news story.
Absolutely.
And it continued as his body was taken back east.
Well, not only was Lyon's death a national news story, but things he did from May through August made the national news. We leave them out in our celebrations with our focus on Virginia in the East. But his confrontation with the Missouri State Guard, there was very, very heavy national news coverage of events throughout the whole summer of 1861 in Missouri. What happened in Missouri and in Arkansas was national news in 1861. It gets left out of our celebrations in 1961 for the centennial, and my own hope is that it won't be left out of the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary.
Now, he was from Connecticut originally?
Originally from Connecticut.
And the funeral was one of the biggest in the history of this country.
He lay in state several places en route, frankly. I can't remember exactly how many, so the public could come and view his body, and then was finally in the State House in Connecticut, and then buried in a family plot near Eastford, Connecticut. It was a very large attended funeral.
Yeah, I think I saw a figure of 15,000 attending the funeral. There's a line, it's called the Wire Road or Telegraph Road, and it's a section linking Springfield to Fort Smith. How important was that in terms of stability for the war?
It was critical, and it really shaped events. That corridor, as I would call it, which really I would say the transportation corridor that's significant starts at St. Louis, runs down to Rolla by rail, from there by road to Springfield, and then down to Fayetteville, Arkansas, and on to Fort Smith. That St. Louis-Fort Smith corridor, as I called it, is really the back door to St. Louis. It's the back door to that main Union focus to go down the Mississippi River. So to carry out their main strategy, open the Mississippi River, the Union has to protect the back door. And so from 1861 with Lyon's operations on until really until early 1863, events in the Indian Territory, in Arkansas and Missouri, tend to revolve around who controls that particular corridor, which is not finally secured by the Union until late 1862. After that's secured, the Confederacy will have to rely largely on a series of cavalry raids. They have lost the main transportation corridor, and they are reduced to pinpricks at the enemy, although some of those raids were pretty potent pinpricks. In retrospect, though, they were never able to wrest Union control away from that.
So really what you had was a guerrilla operation after the control was gotten by the Union.
It's certainly one of the main reasons for the guerrilla war, because the Union was able to control that corridor, to stockpile food in Rolla, in Fayetteville, in Springfield, and after they captured it in Fort Smith. For those opposed to the Union, there are a complete dearth of supplies. There are no railroads in Arkansas to support the operations. And only small units of men that can live off the countryside will work, or raids that pass through and are consuming food and then leave. Every 1,000 men, take a typical Civil War unit, just rounding it off, 1,000 men, men on foot, consumed 3,000 pounds of food a day. So whether they moved forward, whether they sat still, or whether they went back, that's the minimum that 1,000 men and their attached horses, their baggage wagons, the horses. A cavalry unit, even more. Horse needed about 10 pounds of food a day. To sustain a horse by grazing takes 4 to 5 hours. I mean, it's not practical. Tons and tons of food are needed, and that's why battles far away from railroads or rivers are pretty rare. Wilson's Creek, Pea Ridge are relatively large battles away from there, and in each case, food supplies were absolutely critical for those.
What kind of numbers are we talking about in terms of the conflict from the Union side and the Confederate side at Wilson Creek and also Pea Ridge?
Sure. Well, at Wilson's Creek, you had in round numbers 12,000 men on the southern side, and you had just under round numbers 5,000 men on the Union side. At Pea Ridge, I think there were about 17,000 in the Confederate Army, about 15,000, maybe a little more in the Union Army. When Sterling Price raided Missouri in 1864, October, he took a force of 12,000 men through the state, and the Union concentrated, over about 30,000 men chasing him. Those are very large operations, whereas a lot of what gets designated a battle in the Trans-Mississippi consisted of much smaller forces, not because the area was unimportant, because you couldn't sustain large armies.
Now, we talked about the armories and how important that was. What kind of weapons were being used to fight this war?
That's an interesting question, because this is one area in which the fighting west of the Mississippi River was distinctly different from what went on east of the Mississippi River. Union forces throughout the war, wherever they were essentially very well armed. Scrambling early in the war to get enough, but basically the Union soldier, no matter where he fought, was almost always well armed by 62 when the war gears up. East of the Mississippi River, the Confederacy did a very good job of arming and equipping its soldiers under the circumstances. They imported a lot of weapons, they captured a lot of weapons, they established 5 major factories for producing clothing. Lee's men got 100,000 uniforms in 1865 towards the end of the war. But on this side of the Mississippi River, flintlock hunting rifles, shotguns, the sort of things you would use to go hunt ducks, a critical shortage of arms for the Confederate side west of the Mississippi River, and that affects what's going on. Literally, the potential for campaigns are crippled for the South, not just because of that lack of food and the transportation network, but arms and ammunition. When Benjamin McCulloch fought the Battle of Wilson's Creek, his men had on average, this is the southern side of Wilson's Creek, on average 25 rounds a man. Not evenly distributed. Some of his regiments had no more than 8 rounds of ammunition. So this side of the Mississippi River, Confederate operations were critically hampered by inadequate clothing, inadequate shoes, but by completely inadequate weapons. Outdated short-range weapons might have been well suited for raiding, and were indeed. So they could launch very successful cavalry raids. But very, very difficult to stand. For instance, when a cavalry raid in 1863, January 8th, hit Springfield, Missouri, they were poorly armed, and a relatively small Union garrison, well armed, was able to drive off that attack. It's part of the reason. Also, turned out the Union had a really savvy commander there, is a great part of the story. But the inability of the Confederacy to acquire proper arms for its trans-Mississippi forces is a big part of the story.
The other thing with weapons, and we hear these awful stories of some of the things that are happening in the Middle East with troops, but what kind of injuries were caused by the weapons that were used at that time?
Well, as a generalization, the shoulder weapons or various different types of pistols, they're firing a soft lead ball. And when that hits the human being, the lead spreads. Particularly a rifle bullet can do really massive damage. In other words, when it hits bone, it's a shattering force. There's a myth that Civil War doctors needlessly amputated a lot of limbs, that it was sheer ignorance. When bones were shattered, they did not have the ability to do elaborate reconstructive surgery, and they really had no practical option but amputation. And so there was a lot of that. Of course, the main problem was infection, and with no germ theory, no steps they could take to prevent infection, death from gangrene was very common.
Now, the main battle, the Wilson Creek battle, I'm told that that battlefield is in very good condition.
It is.
What could you see in this day and age there?
You can see about 65% of the original battlefield in very pristine condition in a view shed where most of the places when you're visiting the park you do not see any modern housing, even though most of the area immediately adjacent is farm property. Now, that is changing and changing rapidly because Southwest Missouri is growing. But the view shed is still largely unspoiled. The park is in the process of restoring the landscape to the way it would have been originally, which was mostly prairie grass and scattered oaks. But it's possible to walk that battlefield, to walk Bloody Hill, as one of the main hills got nicknamed, to walk along Wilson's Creek, to look at these areas and get a sense that you're seeing the view very close to what it would have been.
All right, we've got about a minute left. Could you list the books that you have been author or co-author of so we can give viewers a chance to figure that one out?
Thank you for the plug. My first publication was a biography of James Longstreet called Lee's Tarnished Lieutenant, James Longstreet and His Place in Southern History. Then with Rick Hatcher, I wrote Wilson's Creek, Second Battle of the Civil War and the Men Who Fought It. We followed that with a guidebook to Pea Ridge, Wilson's Creek, and Prairie Grove, which Rick and I paired up with Earl Hess and Bill Shea, two fine Civil War authors. And my most recent publication in partnership with Tom Sweeney is Portraits of Conflict, A Photographic History of Missouri in the Civil War.
Professor Piston, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on Studio 21.